A fairy, or rather the Fae, are said to be a type of mythical creature known throughout European folklore. Historically, these beings haven't been referred to as completely physical, but rather tend to be described as more spirit-like. During more recent times, fairies are commonly depicted as friendly, helpful, and loving creatures, but for the remainder of this video, you're going to have to get this visualization out of your mind. As far as I can gather, there is no singular, specific origin of the Fae, but rather, there are a collection of beliefs and reported incidents that have occurred throughout Europe, and other continents around the world too, which I suppose could be considered fairly strange. There are also similarities between the traditional European folklore and folklore from other places around the world, such as the Southern Americas, which we'll come to later. Before we go any further and start delving into this, I want to make it abundantly clear that nothing in this video relates to my own personal views. The purpose of this video is not to mock anyone, nor will it be in support of any point of view, but rather I'm going to try to come at this from a completely neutral perspective, and this is something I want you to bear in mind throughout. Or in other words, I don't have a stake in the topic. Now, as said, these kinds of reports didn't come from just a single place, but rather multiple places which were talking about very similar encounters. When going back in time, not all people referred to these supposed beings as friendly, but actually a high number of their encounters were the complete opposite. Some were of the opinion that they were demoted angels or demons sent to plague the lands and to take unsuspecting wanderers. Another recurring point that is frequently made when looking at the folklore is the need to ward them off using protective charms, which again doesn't scream that all of them were friendly. Not every culture knew the fairies by that name either. The Irish, for example, would describe seeing the ace seed in the forest, which translates to little folk. The Celtic people would report something similar too. In fact, the Celts of old describe how a race of little people were driven underground by invading tribes. King James, who reigned between 1603 and 1625, took a particular interest in the Fae. It's not clear what happened or why he became so interested, but he described fairies as illusory spirits or demonic entities that would transport people to a place unknown, and sometimes would aid those of ill intention. It's not clear to me when, why, or how this happened, but the church also took a great interest in this topic and believed that the fairies were a class of demoted angels. In the 19th century, the church's view changed somewhat when they would speak of angelic qualities some of the Fae possessed, and that they now didn't believe that all of them were evil. Now that's all well and good, but traditionally, what actually are they? That's not actually an easy question to answer and seems to depend completely on who you ask. Ellen Castello from historicuk.com describes them as such. Most of us think of fairies as tiny creatures flitting about on gossamer wings waving a magic wand, but history and folklore tell a different tale. When belief in fairies was common, most people didn't like to mention them by name and so referred to them by other names. The little people or the hidden people. Many explanations have been given for a belief in fairies. Some say that they are like ghosts or spirits or fallen angels, those who are neither good enough for heaven or bad enough for the alternative. There are hundreds of different kinds of fairies, some are minute creatures, others grotesque, some can fly, and all can appear and disappear at will. Ellen then goes on to state that the oldest fairies on record in England were first described by the historian Gervase of Tilbury in the 13th century. Some dispute that point and have claimed that there are cave paintings of old that seem to depict something similar to the Fae, though I will note that I couldn't find them and they didn't leave any links, so I'm not sure what they were referring to. It also seems that the belief in fairies isn't specific to one race of fairies, but rather are a collection of many. I didn't know this, but things such as elves, goblins, leprechauns, gnomes, pixies, and others are included among the fairy family. Eventually, through time, though it's not specific as to when, the word fairy became to be used commonly in the phrase fairy tale. Its meaning changed from being specific to some sort of entity that people would report encountering in the forest to a fictitious, fanciful tale of legendary deeds and creatures normally meant for younger people. However, not all have forgotten its original reference and meaning, and there are those to this day that still believe that the Fae exist. In the south of England, there's an absolutely stunning nature reserve known as the Berkshire Downs. In 1962, a farmer's wife reported getting lost in this remote area and was becoming quite panicky. She said that she was desperately trying to make her way back and kept hiking with full belief that she was still heading in the right direction, but was actually taking herself further away from civilization. She came to the realization that she had completely lost her way and didn't know what to do. Now, this is where we're going to have to get bizarre. She said that she stopped for a moment because she thought that she could hear someone nearby, but she couldn't see anyone. She said that the noises continued for a while before a small person, who she thought was male and was dressed in green, made himself known right behind her. She said that they never spoke and that something seemed very odd about the man, and without saying a word, he put her back on the right track. She said that she didn't know what to think at first and didn't see where the man had gone, but after later talking with her husband, she had the feeling that she'd been very lucky. As mentioned earlier, an early belief in regards to the Fae, as presented by King James himself, was that they take people to a place unfamiliar. I'm not quite sure what that then entails, but that seems to be consistent with those that believe today. In Celtic lore, the Fae tend to be associated with underground caverns and springs. Legends spoke of travellers either unknowingly trespassing and going too far into these types of places, only to then go missing and sometimes never be found. Some individuals in the past who believed that they had some sort of unusual Fae encounter would report suddenly being in a place that was unfamiliar to them, but still looked somewhat like the place that they had entered from. Upon returning, they would complain that more time had passed than they had expected and realised. Now, of course, it's worth stating that reports, or perhaps even tales of things like this happening a long time ago, can't be verified in any way, shape or form. But these types of stories or incidents, depending on your perspective, can be found within the folklore. What is absolutely fascinating to me when it comes to folklore is how it actually exists in the first place, because one of the following must almost certainly be true. King James and people of our distant past took a great interest in the topic because they had experiences of their own that they couldn't explain in any conventional manner and thought that they were unusual. Or, these stories were concocted for one reason or another. It's hard to assume a motive, but perhaps they were always intended to be fictitious, but people started to actually believe them. Or perhaps people at the very least truly believed that they were having these kinds of experiences, even though it could have been otherwise explained. One would assume that there were more people spending time in the woods back then than do today, which of course could account for the high number of reports of this back then, whether truly experienced or otherwise. Now, before we get into incidents and people's personal experiences, let's first talk about the rules of engagement. A common belief among those who believe in the Fae is that some are highly mischievous and masters of manipulation to a malevolent degree. According to those that know the history and folklore far better than I ever will, state that part of their ingenuity comes from being master manipulators of language. They state that the Fae will twist your words and will find loopholes in any agreement made to their benefit at a detriment to the other person. Here are the rules of engagement, and just generally speaking, I'm not sure of the origin or how they became well known, but here they are. 1. Be polite and never insult, interrupt, or do anything that would anger whatever it is that you've encountered in the forest. 2. If you ever find yourself with a foreboding sense of being watched or feeling unwelcome whilst on a hike, it's time to leave. 3. Iron is offensive to the Fae, and if it's something that you're worried about, should be left out of your garden. 4. The Fae love gifts, but they must be sweet, or it could turn into a negative encounter. 5. Time moves differently whilst with the Fae, and you're likely to lose hours or longer. 6. Never directly state either thank you or I'm sorry, Rather, it should be "I appreciate that" or "pardon me." I couldn't find an explanation as to why that might be the case though. 7. When spoken to, listen very carefully because there is often hidden meaning. 8. The Fae are thought of as protectors, so don't do anything destructive in their environments. 9. Try not to make any agreements, but if it happens, be very careful as they are masters of manipulation and loopholes. Finally, certain areas are completely off limits, and you'll know when this is the case if you're in one. Those who believe in the Fae claim that when looking back through history, certain areas were said to be cursed by the ancient peoples and could have something to do with that with which we have no real understanding of. One legend I remember well resides on Mount Shasta. Early Native Americans would complain of their people, specifically hunting and exploration parties going missing on the mountain, and they said that the area was cursed. They would speak of a bright stone that would travel the mountain and swallow people whole. Of course, it's not clear what actual event took place that would cause the Native Americans to say this. Or again, if it was supposed to be fictitious to keep their children from straying into dangerous areas. I suppose it completely depends on how you wish to interpret the information, and that of course will be different for everybody. There are those today that still maintain the belief that the area is cursed and do their best to stay away. Another such curse is that of the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. Throughout history, travellers through this area would take pieces of the petrified wood as keepsakes, which of course became illegal when the area was named a national monument in 1906. Interestingly, those who would take pieces of petrified wood would report their life changing for the worse by being hit by repeated bouts of bad luck. And there were those who were completely convinced that it had something to do with the wood. In the 1930s, many visitors to the park would report being plagued with bad luck after stealing the wood. One was quoted as saying that he thought that he'd gotten away with it, but he now thinks that he was seen taking it, not by a person or the authorities, but by something else of which he wasn't specific. Funnily enough, park rangers and those within the admin teams have received countless anonymous letters over the years of people describing how sorry they were for stealing the petrified wood. The letters would generally state that they were sorry for doing it and that their life had not been the same after taking it, and would ask if the rangers would take the wood back to its origin area. I'm not actually sure when the park did this, but they shared some snippets of letters which included things such as, "It was a great challenge sneaking it out of the park, but 10 years since that time, nothing in my life has gone right." Another stated, "My life has been totally destroyed since we've been back from vacation. Please put these back so my life can get back to normal." And another, "Take these miserable rocks and put them back. They have caused pure havoc in my love life." Now of course, perhaps these unfortunate events were always going to take place anyway, and I don't mean to laugh at people's misfortune. But what's amusing is that the stolen items can't be returned properly because they have now been taken out of scientific context, is the way it was phrased. Meaning that the park is actually a thriving site for archaeological, geological, and paleontological research, and moving things around like this would be harmful to the studies, so they can't be returned. I'm paraphrasing here, but Kathy Weiser from legendsofamerica.com states that in the Rainbow Forest Museum lies a display called The Mystery of the Conscious Wood. A large piece of petrified wood sits on a bench there, which was returned by a man who admitted to stealing it 67 years ago. Beneath the display sits a 3-ring binder which contains letters from all over the world, with over 1,200 pages of these guilt-ridden letters. Here are some of the quotes that Kathy picked out. "Believe me, if I would have known the curse went with any of the rocks, I would never have taken these. My life has been totally destroyed since we've been back from vacation. Forgive me for ever taking these. When we were there, we read the letters of the many people who would return wood to you with tales of bad luck, ruined marriages, as well as other stories of misfortune. At first, we did not believe the ramblings of such obviously superstitious persons, but upon review of the life and lack of luck that our family member has had these past 30 years, We have begun to wonder if possibly the legend could have some truth to it. I picked up this petrified rock about 13 years ago when I visited the national park. I came across it today and decided that I should send it back to you. I'm sorry that I took it and wish for you to have it back. Thank you. P.S. It has been bad luck to me. It's unclear if these people would have experienced the things that they thought they did without taking the items in the first place, but there's no way you could ever determine that. They sure seem to think that it was their own doing for stealing the wood or rocks in the first place. Now, while obviously I have no idea what that has to do with fairies, if one's assumption is that they are real, then it makes absolutely no sense that they would be situated to Europe alone. I'm not aware of any border that could stop an invisible small person from crossing it. Anyway, the point is that when you look through folklore of various places around the world, you come across very similar accounts in terms of these kinds of encounters, only they're given a different name. To take two examples, there are the duende, which have featured before on the channel during a disappearance no less, where the locals and shamans fully believe that the duende were responsible for it, and were somewhat at odds with some of the park rangers. I'll place the reporting on that disappearance towards the end of the video, and I'll let you know beforehand, so if you've already seen my prior video on it, you can skip it. The other example would be the jinn, which are spoken of across the Islamic faith. Let's start with the jinn. First of all, there is that very misconception that the jinn were only really spoken about after the widespread adoption of the Islamic faith. However, this isn't actually true, and the jinn were spoken about in very early pre-Islamic Arabia, though they of course did find their way into the Islamic mythology and theology. Similar to the European Fae, the people of old in the area would speak of both positive and negative encounters and would state that they were neither evil nor innately good, and it just varied. The jinn have always been thought of as demons though, or at least beings that did not accept their god's guidance. I didn't touch on all this earlier with the Fae for the sake of time, but the jinn were regularly credited to misfortune, possession, and disease, which has always been applicable to the Fae through folklore. Similar to the Fae, there isn't any kind of origin story, but rather a collection of experiences and reported incidents that the experiencee didn't believe could be explained conventionally. Scholars of old believed that they were malevolent spirits that resided in wilderness areas, sometimes taking the form of animals. They believed that they would lure their victim into a different land, which sounds awfully familiar. In today's times, those in more urban areas tend to view the jinn as nothing more than a story or a superstition, while those in more rural areas still report unusual encounters to this day. I recall one specifically that involved the US military and Jordanian troops who were taking part in training exercises in Jordan at a place known as Batan el Ghul. This translates to Belly of the Beast. It's not clear how the area received its name, but some US troops would report experiencing night terrors, while a number of Jordanian troops would wake up frightened and reportedly told their leading officers that they had seen something among them. Now, the duende on the other hand are known throughout the Southern Americas and are also described as entities of small stature. In fact, many of the descriptions fit almost perfectly with the European Fae. Just like the other two, the duende don't have an origin story, but again, the folklore mostly consists of experiences and reported incidents. Similarly, throughout history, both positive and negative experiences have been reported during these supposed encounters. They are said to be mischievous and master manipulators. The legends state that they would use their talents to lure small people, mostly of a young age, into the forest and would cause them to lose their way. Of course, that doesn't directly reference the idea of, and I quote, taking them somewhere else, whatever that means. But I suppose that it could be interpreted as such. Though as said, not every report was bad, and some reported incidents in the Southern Americas spoke of these small helpers leading people out of the forest so they could find their way home, which sounds similar to the farmer's wife incident from earlier. Speaking of unusual incidents, let's explore some. Now first and foremost, it's important to clarify that it's not like I can verify the incidents took place, nor can I speak of the credulity of those sharing. However, they are shared truthfully nonetheless, and still worth hearing and discussing. Again, let's make it absolutely clear that I am not endorsing or opposing any incident, merely sharing them for the purpose of discussion. This first person gave me permission to talk about his experience, but didn't specify as to whether he would like to remain anonymous or not. So for the sake of safety and privacy, I'm going to keep his name anonymous, and he shall be referred to as John Doe. During John's childhood, his grandparents owned a summer house in a wooded area in northern Sweden, and this would be where his experience took place. When John was 10, he had gone to visit his grandparents with the intention of staying there for the summer with his family. His grandparents owned a series of cabins which allowed the family to come over and stay. John stayed in a cabin with his cousins and were located approximately 30 meters away from the grandparents. Right beside the cabins is a lake, and this area was a long way from the nearest town. John said that while they did have electricity, they didn't have running water and had to collect their own because it was so rural. Directly in front of the cabin was the lake, and behind the cabin was thick woods. John related that every time they would go hiking in that place, it always felt eerie somehow. On a number of occasions, John's granddad would tell the family about seeing things in the woods that he didn't quite know how to explain. He said that he'd seen little people that would disappear, and he believed that they lived in the woods. He also spoke of seeing these little people crossing the dirt paths in the forest, and people nearby would freeze in place until the little people had gone. John's cousin heard this conversation and during a hike made a joke of the situation and froze in place while saying he'd found the little people's trails. John said that his granddad wasn't happy about this and that you shouldn't joke about the little people, especially while in the woods. There was no further mention of it, and later during the evening, John and his cousin went to their cabin to turn in for the night. He said that they were awoken by commotion going on all around the cabin. He said that it sounded like there were multiple bears outside scratching at the cabin, while what sounded like pebbles were hitting the roof and raining down the side of the cabin. John continued and said that he and his cousin completely froze in place and were terrified, and that the sounds of scratching now seemed to be emanating from beneath their beds. He said that this escalated and it sounded like they were surrounded by absolute chaos. They got up and sprinted to their grandfather's cabin and told them what had happened. The following day, the grandfather took them on the same route in the woods and had them scatter candy in the forest, and they also apologised. John finished by saying that was the most extreme experience he had ever had and related just how surreal it felt. Now this next incident was reported in the Bloomington Daily Leader newspaper on the 31st of March 1886, but occurred many years prior. The article in the newspaper is quite long and drawn out, so I'm going to summarise it somewhat. The incident revolves around Andy Crow and his daughter, who was not named, so she'll be referred to as Jane Doe. At the time, the pair were living in a very rural area in Dubuque County, as Andy owned a farm there. Andy recalled that as his daughter was nearing adulthood, she was constantly becoming ill and physicians weren't of any help. It's understandable that this next part happened during the time period, but after being repeatedly told that they weren't sure what was causing the illnesses, Andy took his daughter to see Father Bernard of the New Mellery Monastery. Father Bernard was well respected in the community and agreed to pray with Jane. It was said that he also had a hand in getting Jane some prescribed medicine, but it's not clear what or if he mediated this with the local medical professionals. During one trip home with Andy, after praying with Bernard, Jane told her father that everything Bernard was doing wasn't going to help and that she was going to be taken by the fairies. Andy said that at the time, he didn't really pay attention to what she was saying, but roughly around a year later, Jane was reported missing. Andy said that all of her belongings, including her clothing and shoes, had been left behind. I'm not sure what law enforcement looked like in the county back then, but a search was initiated for Jane. Searchers dragged the neighbouring creeks and explored the nearby woods and fields for her, but they never found her. When Jane wasn't located, people became suspicious of Andy and claimed that foul play must have been involved. Jane did return, however, sometime later, and she relayed that she had been with the fairies the whole time and had been travelling the country. She said that she had been in strange vehicles that couldn't be seen by the naked eye. On the third day of Jane's return, she told people that she would be leaving again soon as they had come back for her, and sure enough, she left again. The Bloomington Daily Leader said that Andy had been consistent through the years with his story, and said that after learning about the tales of fairies in Ireland, he believed that is what had happened. Now obviously that happened such a long time ago that it's impossible to really know what happened, or if it was even supposed to be truthful in the first place, though it wasn't reported on as though it was fiction, so who knows what version of Chinese whispers were playing. This next incident took place in the 17th century and was centred around a woman known as Ann Jeffries. Anne was actually born in 1626 and passed away in 1698 at the age of 72, but in the years prior, Anne and the Pitt family would report some very unusual events that revolved around Anne. These incidents were documented by Moses Pitt, who wrote a letter to Reverend Dr. Edward Fowler, Bishop of Gloucestershire at the time, seeking advice. 1645, when Anne was 19 years old, is where this case really begins. She had just managed to secure herself a job working for the wealthy Pitt family, maintaining their estate home. It's not clear in what year this occurred, but after finishing her morning duties one day, she sat in the Pitts' garden inside their arbour. While there, she would later relate that she heard someone moving past branches and was heading in her direction. She ignored this, thinking it was one of the family members or a visitor, but was taken aback when she heard what she described as peculiar ringing coming from every direction. She said that she felt afraid, but didn't think that anyone would do her harm on such a bright day where people would be able to hear and see them. She went on and said that during the ringing, 6 small men dressed in green appeared nearby. She said that they were charming and had big eyes. She would later refer to them as fairies. She described that her environment had changed and that they had somehow paralysed her and had taken her into, and I quote, a castle in the sky. Which I'm sure we all know what that sounds like. I can't really share what happened next on YouTube, but just think about the birds and the bees. Anne did actually go missing that day, and the Pitt family said that they couldn't locate her. She did return though, and the Pitt family found her groggy and crumpled on the floor in their garden. Anne stayed quiet about her ordeal for a time, but would later relate that these small people would become her tormentors as they would return to her every so often, which always frightened her. These experiences would go on for a year before she confided in one of the Pitt family members. Unfortunately, it seems that she placed her faith in the wrong person, because shortly after sharing what she'd gone through, she was arrested for witchcraft. As far as I can tell, we know this because there was a piece of correspondence from the mayor in 1647 which can now be found in the Clarendon Manuscripts Archive. This document seems to confirm that Anne was held in the jail. An odd snippet states that despite being deprived of food for several months, she didn't seem to suffer any detriment to her health, which can't have helped her witchcraft case. Anne did later state that she was visited by the fairies while she was in the jail and that they would feed her with an unusual bread, whatever that means. Anne was later released, though I'm not sure what the reason or circumstances were behind her release, but she would go on to marry a labourer called William Warren and became involved in nursing. She said that she didn't know how, but the fairies had given her great knowledge about health and she wanted to use it to help cure the ailments of others. In 1693, Moses Pitt, who had somewhat vaguely maintained his friendship with Anne, took great interest in what had happened to her those years prior. He brought a friend of his named Humphrey Martin, who I imagine was the equivalent of a journalist back then, to interview her. However, she wasn't interested. Humphrey would later write to Moses. As for Ann Jeffries, I have been with her the greater part of one day and did read to her all that you wrote to me. But she would not own anything of it as concerning the fairies or any of the cures that she would perform. I asked her the reason why she would not do it. She replied that if she should discover it to you, that you would make books and ballads of it. And she said that she would not have her name spread about the country in books and ballads of such things. Of course, it's difficult to know what to make of all that, given that it was such a long time ago, but the belief in fairies was widespread at that time, and there were many reported incidents similar to Ann's. Of course, the fairies taking her into a castle in the sky makes me think of something else, a different type of snatching, that I can't get into too much because YouTube doesn't like that topic anymore. Anyway, I think that at the very least, Ann did believe that these events were quite literally happening to her. Now, before we talk about the disappearance where the Duende were actually blamed, a Reddit user compiled some of the work by author W.Y. Evans Wentz, who held a sustained belief in fairies and that there was more to them than we could understand. This Reddit user, of which you will find a link to in the description below, then drew some similarities to the missing 411 and a book written by Wentz in 1910 called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. Here are some direct comparisons. Firstly, David Polides notes that a lot of the types of disappearance that he covers seem to take place near boulder fields. Here's what Wentz had to say in 1910. Fairy preserves. A heap of stones in a field should not be disturbed, despite the need of building, especially if they are part of an ancient tumulus. The fairies are said to live inside the pile, and to move the stones would be most unfortunate. If you've read any of David's earlier books, especially the first one I think, he notes many cases where people have gone missing while either near berry bushes or picking from them. In Wentz's book, he relayed an incident by a man he had come into contact with during his research. The incident is titled, "A Girl Recovered from the Fairy." One day, just before sunset in midsummer, I, a boy then, my brother, and cousin were gathering bilberries, also known as whortleberries, up by the rocks at the back of here when all at once we heard what sounded like music. We hurried around the rocks, and there we were within a few hundred feet of 6 or 8 of the gentlefolk, and they were dancing. When they saw us, a little woman dressed all in red came running out from them towards us, and she struck my cousin across the face with what seemed to be a green rush. We ran for home as hard as we could, and before reaching the house, my cousin fell and passed away. Father saddled a horse and went for Father Ryan. When Father Ryan arrived, he put a stole about his neck and began praying over my cousin and reading psalms and striking her with the stole, and in that way brought her back. He said if she had not caught hold of my brother, she would have been taken forever. When they were referring to bringing her back, I think they were specifically referring to a spiritual sense more so than anything else. This next one is weird because I've covered many disappearances where this has been the case, but David identified that when some of these people were disappearing, a lot of the time they would be wearing bright colours. This is what Wentz had to say. In the neighbourhood of Snowdon, the fairies were believed to live beneath the lakes, from which they sometimes came forth, especially on misty days, and children used to be warned not to stray away from their homes in that sort of weather, lest they would be taken by them. These fairies were not Christians, and they were great thieves. They were fond of bright colours. They were sharp of hearing, and no word that reached the wind would escape them. This video is becoming quite long now, so I won't go over any more of them, and I would invite you to have a read of the post on Reddit. It goes on to cover other things too, such as the weather worsening at the start of the disappearance, intellectuals, people of Germanic descent. Some people will come back in a state of confusion, and even Yosemite is mentioned, so you might find it interesting. Finally, let's end by going back in time and revisiting a case I reported on where a man went missing in the Madidi National Park in Bolivia. The Bolivian Amazon, or specifically the Madidi National Park, according to nytimes.com, goes from lowland to mountaintop from 600 feet to almost 20,000 feet above sea level. It covers more than 7,000 square miles of wildly different habitats. It has cloud forests, lowland jungles, rivers, streams, wetlands, it even has glaciers. The locals state that this jungle can swallow you whole in a matter of seconds, and they say so for good reason. Rivers are vast and go through mountainous terrain with thick blankets of fog creeping throughout the jungle. Surprisingly, despite its vastness and low visibility, disappearances inside the national park's borders are fairly rare. There hadn't been a single recorded disappearance in the park for a long time until late February 2017. At 8:30 PM on this particular night, the Madidi Park Rangers received a radio transmission in which it was relayed to them that 25-year-old Meikul Akuna had disappeared under highly unusual circumstances and left no tracks behind. They were made aware that Meikul had been on a rainforest tour with the local agency Max Adventures, and that he was last seen sitting on the steps of his cabin at around 8:30 PM the night before. The park director, Marcos Uzquiano, said, "This is a really strange case for us. We're not sure what happened last night, but we need to find out." The rangers on scene made comparisons to a disappearance that took place in 1981, where a tourist by the name of Yossi Ginsberg was lied to and given deceitful information by a fellow traveller. This led Yossi to being stranded in the rainforest for 3 weeks. But this incident was different. After the individuals in the group were questioned, it was thought that this was not the case. The rangers were described as being quiet and looking very determined. They quickly set off and began to search the immediate area inside the rainforest, thinking that Meikul couldn't have gotten very far given the harsh terrain and he was wearing sandals. Fazer, a guide for Max Adventures, relayed some interesting details. Fazer said in regards to Meikul that he had returned to the camp acting noticeably excited. He was acting a little bit strange, his face just didn't look normal. Fazer was keeping tabs on Meikul and invited him and the other tourists to participate in a Pachama ceremony, which is an ancient tradition thanking the Mother Earth for giving them permission to enter the forest. Meikul refused the invitation and remained at his cabin. From the point that Fazer left with the other tourists, another guide had made the visit to Meikul within 5 minutes, but he had gone. Fazer and the other guides, equipped with flashlights, scoured the lodge and combed the immediate area inside the nearby forest to no avail. Fazer said that they were searching until 5 in the morning and was surprised that he couldn't be located. Fazer said, and I quote, "It's because he offended the Pachamama, he didn't want to participate in the ceremony." After doing a bit of further reading, it seems like the locals are very superstitious of the area, and they say that the rainforest is filled with mystical entities, both good and bad. Locals believe that to disrespect the Pachamama is to put yourself at risk from being driven mad by Duende, which they believe to be a spirit that lurks in the forest and has the ability to take and hide its victims. One of the guides, who had spent most of his life in the area, had this to say, "For myself and the rangers, this is our culture. We believe that the Duende is real and we think that it's possible that Meikul was taken by him. If this incident wasn't already strange enough for you, let's get bizarre." Because they didn't know what to do, the guides called for 2 shamans by the names of Romulo and Tabushia and asked them to bring Meikul back. The pair arrived and brought various ingredients with them, including cigarettes, beers, wine bottles, cocoa leaves, sugar, candles, sparkling confetti and a large wooden cross. They said, and I quote, "We believe that Duende has been harnessing the energy of Mapujo, a powerful tree spirit, to hide Meikul. He's far away, in a place we can't reach, but by performing the necessary intricate ceremonies we may be able to bring him back." At this point, Meikul's family, including his father, stepmother and sister, had flown in from Chile. Under the guidance of the park rangers and other professionals, they joined the organised search efforts. The rangers thought it best to work section by section, coming multiple kilometres around the lodge by walking in sweeping horizontal lines. I may be wrong, but I get the feeling that some of the rangers didn't care much for what the shamans were doing, and the shamans didn't believe the rangers could be successful until the spirits were appeased. Nevertheless, despite the differences, the rangers searched for 10 hours a day in different sections of the rainforest, desperately trying to find Meikul as they knew time was of the essence. The shamans also stayed up until dawn every night, making offerings and performing their ceremonies in payment to the Pachamama. Interestingly, and perhaps even bizarrely, the rangers did concede that they were surprised that they couldn't find even the slightest sign of him, no tracks or any trace at all. They said it was like he was never there. The experienced trackers among the rangers said that they couldn't believe that they hadn't found a single shred of evidence, and one of them was quoted as saying, "In 20 years we've never experienced anything quite like this before. For those familiar with the channel, this next part may not come as much of a surprise anymore." 6 days after the initial disappearance and tireless searching by all involved, one of the rangers found one of Maycool's socks on the rainforest floor, seemingly abandoned. This gave the rangers a location to focus their search efforts, and a new plan was produced to zone in on the area, which they immediately began to thoroughly comb. The shaman said that this was a good sign and that the findings changed everything. They were of the opinion that the sock represented a way to reach out to Maycool's soul to bring him back. The shamans then spent the next 2 days and nights without sleep, performing their ceremonies and presenting offerings to the Pachamama. The following day, they said that their payments had been accepted and that the following days would see more signs of Maycool. The day after this would see the rangers taking a boat down the river, where they heard the guides shouting at them to come over. The rangers docked and the guides called out that they'd found Maycool. Surprisingly, while he was somewhat dehydrated and had a lot of bites, he had swollen ankles and he was otherwise okay. Maycool joked and said that he wanted a Coca-Cola. At this point, let's get bizarre again, why not? Maycool was brought back to camp, where he told of what happened to him during his time missing. "I was trying so hard to find the river, but I just couldn't find it," he told the rescuers. He went on and said that he was only able to make it because he was following a group of monkeys that would drop him fruit and lead him to shelter and water. When asked why he went into the rainforest, this is what he had to say. "I was having strange, terrible thoughts about the rainforest and I just wanted to get out. I started running. I was wearing sandals and I said no, they would slow me down. I threw away the sandals, then the cell phone and my flashlight. And after so much running, I stopped under a tree and I started thinking, what had I done? What was I doing? And then when I wanted to get back, it wasn't possible." Maycool said that he isn't completely sure what happened to him that night or why he made the decisions he did. Obviously, the shamans on the other hand, alongside the locals, maintained that it was the duende's doing. They said, the signs fit, his strange behaviour pattern, the maddening thoughts, that's what duende does. Ultimately though, the circumstances leading up to and during Maycool's disappearance remain a mystery. What are your thoughts about this truly bizarre incident? I don't think I've ever come across an incident like this before. Anyway, I'm going to end this one here. I just wanted to say a big thank you to my patrons who are really helping this channel a lot, so thank you very much for your continued support. And thank you for watching. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, it helps me a lot. And if not, then feel free to leave a dislike, I'm just looking for your honest opinion to do share. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening depending on where you are. Be safe guys, and I'll see you next time. Peace.